Chapter 17 of Finn the Wolfhound by Alec John Dawson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. Freedom. Very wonderful and wolf-like, cat-like too in some respects, was Finn's progress through the circus encampment on that bright moonlit night. The field was full of silvery moonlight, you would have said, but never a glint of all that liquid silver touched Finn's outline for a moment. Just so, beside the northern mountains of another continent, one has watched a leopard, mountain lions we call them there, braving the strange, terrible smells and dangers of a man's camp to stalk a sleeping fox terrier. In absolute ignorance of the rifle barrel that covered it, yet miraculously successful in never giving the man behind the rifle the chance of a moonlit shot. Finn was sore and aching from many wounds, and stiff from long confinement. He knew that everyone connected with the circus was sleeping, but on this occasion he gave no hostages to fortune, he took no risks. The stakes at issue, as he saw it, were upon the one side life and freedom, freedom which was almost unbearably sweet to think of after the long-drawn agony of the past couple of months, and upon the other side slow death under the torture of confinement, the iron, the lash, and the mad man-beast in the leathern coat. It is the greatest mistake in the world to suppose that an animal like Finn has no imagination. Indeed, the animals which have no imagination are comparatively few, while such an Irish Wolfhound as Finn has, at the least, as much of it as some men the writer has known. A fiery picture of the issues at stake was floating in Finn's mind as he crept in and out among the tents and wagons of the enclosure, and he was conscious neither of wounds or weakness or stiffness, but only of his great resolve, based upon the wonderful chance that had come to him. Once he came to a place where 10 feet of brilliant moonlight lay between the black shadow he occupied and the next. He paused for a moment or two, looking about him upon every side with all the cunning of the truly wild kindred, and then, with a very good imitation of the lightness and elasticity of other happier days, he sprang clear from the one shadow to the other, landing as delicately and silently as a cat, though the impact jarred all his stiffened joints, and touched, as with living fire, every one of his almost innumerable wounds. Then he came to the outer canvas wall of the big enclosure. It was too high to jump, a good 12 feet. An attempt to jump and scramble over it might have led to noise. Finn approached it in the deep shadow cast by a caravan wagon, and thrusting his muzzle underneath the canvas, midway between two stakes, easily forced it up and crawled under it into the open. When he was halfway out, the boss's fox terrier gave one sleepy half bark, too languid and indifferent a sound to be taken as a warning. And for the rest, complete silence paid tribute to the extreme deftness of Finn's passage through the sleeping camp. But that low, sleepy bark from the fox terrier, who slept beside the boss's own caravan, served to stop the beating of Finn's heart for one long moment. In the next moment, almost as silently as a passing cloud shadow, the great Wolfhound streaked across the 30 yards of moonlit paddock which divided the camp from the ring-barked bush, and melted away among that crowded assembly of tree-ghosts. The barbed wire fence of the paddock was no more than 4 feet high, and this Finn took in his stride without appreciable pause. The ring-barking of trees admits sunlight and air to the earth, and this means rich feed and a sturdy undergrowth. On the other hand, the death of the trees introduces a kind of nakedness and publicity to the bush which naturally is not favoured by wild folk during daylight. But this does not detract from the merits of ring-barked country as a night feeding ground, and Finn was amazed by the wealth and variety of wild life which he saw as he loped swiftly through the few miles of bush lying between the circus camp and the foothills of the mountains beyond. His immediate purpose, of putting a considerable distance between himself and the place of his captivity, was too urgent to admit of delays, no matter what the temptation, and accordingly Finn made no pauses. But it added greatly to the joy of his escape to find himself surrounded by so great an abundance of creatures which instinct made him regard as game for him. Upon every hand there were rustlings and whisperings, tiny footfalls and scrufflings among dead leaves and twigs; and here and there, as the great grey shadowy Wolfhound swept along between the white tree trunks, he had glimpses of rabbits, bandicoots, kangaroo rats, and many of the lesser marsupials, all busy about their different night affairs, all half paralyzed by amazement at his passage through their midst. Once he heard a venomous spitting overhead, and, as he hurried on, caught a flying glimpse of a native cat, who had pinned an adventurous young 'possum on the lower limb of a giant blackbutt. Once, too, he was startled into momentary horror of some human trap of the Professor's invention, and his speed approached that of flying, under the spur of a laughing jackass's raucous cachinnation. The ring-barked country was soon left behind, and then Finn found himself among dense living bush, climbing a steep ascent. Here his speed was necessarily a great deal slower. There was a good deal of undergrowth upon the mountain side, besides much heavy timber, and hidden among this lush undergrowth were occasional boulders and innumerable falling tree trunks, over which Finn stumbled heavily again and again, he being without that curious bush lore which enables menfolk born in the bush, no less than its own wild folk, to steer clear of these obstructions by means of a sort of sixth sense, which tells them when they must leap, and helps them to know when the leap must be an extra cautious one, because of the danger of disturbing the deadly people of the wild. The Australian bush has many varieties of snakes, and quite a good number of them are deadly, though some of those most formidable in appearance are not. Finn had never even seen a snake, so that though his ignorance made him run many risks that night, he was at least spared all anxiety regarding the deadly folk, their quick tempers and swift methods of attack. Dawn was not far off when Finn emerged with heaving flank and lolling tongue into the green but stony glade which formed the ridge and crest of the Tynagh range. The last 100 yards of his progress had been a good deal of a scramble, through the thick scrub and over lichen-covered boulders on a very steep rise. And now that he had reached the cool glade of topmost Tynagh, he found that his arrival had caused considerable perturbation among a small mob of brumbies, or wild horses, consisting of some 7 or 8 mares and foals, led by a flea-bitten old grey stallion, who snorted angrily as he saw Finn, and minced forward toward the Wolfhound, his long chisel teeth bared, his 4-foot tail billowing out behind him like a flag, and his black hoofs (the feet of mountain-bred brumbies are prodigiously hard and punishing in the attack) rising and falling from the dewy earth like spring hammers. Finn devoted the little breath he could spare to the rather whining note of explanation which means, "Don't fear me, I pursue my own affairs only, and they are harmless to you." But the old stallion was taking no chances. Age made him fussy, and his family included 2 very recent additions. Also, Finn brought a baffling mixture of scents with him, including those of men and of wild creatures such as the stallion had never seen and did not wish to see. So he continued his threateningly mincing progress toward Finn, and whinnied out a declaration to the effect that this could be no resting place for dingoes, however huge and diversified in their smells. Finn was not in the least like a dingo, but on the other hand he was not like a kangaroo hound. He was twice the size of a dingo very nearly, and a good 7 inches taller than the biggest kangaroo hound the stallion had seen. Also his coat was shaggy and long, instead of close and short like that of a greyhound or kangaroo hound. As against that, he carried with him more suggestion of the fellowship of the wild kindred than of the tribe of renegades who were menfolk's adherents; and therefore, for the moment, Dingo was a good enough name for him, so far as the old stallion was concerned, the dingo being the only creature of the wolf kind which he knew. Finn was in no mood for disputes of any sort, and so, though exceedingly weary now, he made a wide detour to satisfy the nervousness of the flea-bitten grey stallion, and began a diagonal descent upon the south side of Tynagh. Just as the sun cleared the horizon over his right shoulder, Finn dropped wearily down from a clump of wattle upon a broad flat ledge of many-coloured rock which caught the sun's first glinting rays upon its queer enamel of red and brown and yellow lichen. From this point Finn looked down a densely wooded mountain side and out across a tolerably well-timbered plain to hills which stood nearly 40 miles away. It would have made an eyrie for a king eagle. Finn had already slaked his thirst hurriedly a mile back in a chattering, rock-bedded mountain streamlet, and now he was weary beyond all further endurance. He had been sick and sore and stiff and sadly out of condition when he started, and he had been travelling now for 6 hours. A feeling of security had stolen over him since he reached the topmost ridge of Tynagh. The very fragrance of the air told him, as he drew it in through his nostrils, that he was far from the works of men. Food he could not think of, while every bone and muscle in his great body ached from weariness. By the edge of the rock was a sandy hollow, over which a feathery shrub drooped 3 or 4 of its graceful branches at a height of 3 feet from the ground. Finn eyed this inviting spot steadily for 2 or 3 minutes, while his aching sides continued to heave, and his long tongue to sway from one side of his jaws. Then he stepped cautiously into the sheltered nook, turned completely round in it 3 or 4 times, and finally sank to rest there in a compact coil, and with a little grunt of contentment and relief. Finn opened his eyes and half opened them many times during the day. Once, to his utter amazement, when a huge wedge-shaped eagle swept gloriously past with a lamb in its talons no more than 10 feet above his nose. But the day was practically done, and nightfall approaching, when the Wolfhound finally rose from his sandy bed and stretched his 7-foot length from nose to tail. The long stretch drew a sharp whine from him towards its end, when the stiffness and soreness of his limbs, and of some of his more recent burns and bruises, found him out. But even in the pain there was a sense of luxury and gladness for Finn. His sleep had not been devoid of sudden starts, of shudderings and twitches, born of a fearful dreaming. But now that he was broad awake, and in the hushed grey twilight looked out across 40 miles of wild open land, with never a sign of tent or house or other work of man, his heart swelled within him with satisfaction and content, and he drew deep breaths of grateful pleasure and relief before setting out upon the descent of Tynagh, and, if it might be, the capture of a supper. Before Finn had travelled half a mile along the hillside he made his first acquaintance with the snake people. In descending at a sharp angle from the side of a fallen tree, his 4 feet just scraped the end of the tail of a 9-foot carpet snake, whose colouring was vivid and fresh. Before Finn knew what had happened, one coil of the sinuous reptile's body was about his left hind leg, and as the startled Wolfhound wheeled in his tracks, the big snake's head rose at him with a forbidding, long-drawn psst of defiance. The rapidly tightening pressure about his muscular lower thigh produced something like panic in Finn's breast, but luckily enough his panic resulted in speeding him toward precisely the right course of action. He feinted in the direction of his hind leg, and then, as the snake plunged for his neck, his jaws flashed back and caught the reptile just behind the head. A single bite was sufficient, for it smashed the snake's vertebra and almost divided it. A moment later Finn's teeth were at the coil about his hind leg, and in another instant he was free. But he was too greatly shocked to make a meal upon the remains of his enemy, which is what he should have done, and after taking a good look at its long, brilliantly coloured body, he was glad to make off down the hill, travelling now with a good deal more caution than he had shown before. It was a merciful thing for Finn that his first contact with the snake people should have brought him in touch only with the powerful and courageous carpet snake, and not with one of the many deadly venomous members of his tribe. This experience rather shook Finn by reason of its utter strangeness to him. He recalled the spitting venom of the native cat, of whose kill he had caught a fleeting glimpse on the previous night. That again was rather strange and outside his experience. This great open wild world was certainly quite unlike the mild, half-domesticated and cared-for little patch of wild that Finn had claimed as his hunting ground beside the Sussex Downs. Just then a laughing jackass started a hoarse chuckle above Finn's head, and a big white cockatoo, startled by the jackass, flew screaming out from the branches of a grey gum, with the agonized note in its cry which these birds seem to favour at all seasons, and quite irrespective of the nature of their occupations at the moment. The loose skin on Finn's shoulders moved uneasily as he trotted along, using the most extreme care. But with all his care he was in strange surroundings, and his bush lore was all to learn. And because of his strangeness his most careful gait seemed a noisy and clumsy one to the little wild folk of that mountain side, and Finn saw none of them. By chance he saw one of the larger kind, however, and the sight of it added to his sense of strangeness, for it was unlike any other beast he had ever seen. This was a large female rock wallaby, a big grey doe with her young one. The youngster was at the awkward age, free of the teat, yet unable to travel alone. It was nibbling and playing some distance from its big mother when she had her first warning of Finn's approach in the crackling of dead twigs under his powerful feet. The youngster showed awkwardness in getting to its snug retreat in the mother's pouch, and so, by these delays, Finn was given his glimpse of a big marsupial in the act of taking a 15-foot leap through the scrub. Finn almost sat down on his haunches from astonishment. But unlike the snake, the wallaby inspired him with no sort of fear, possibly by reason of its evident fear of him. It was, however, another item in the strangeness, the complete unfamiliarity of Finn's present surroundings. It seems absurd to suggest that the great Wolfhound may have been suffering from loneliness, seeing that he had never been so thankful for anything else in his whole life as he was for his escape from the circus with its small army of menfolk and animals. But it is a fact that, as Finn plodded along through the wild bush to the south of Tynagh, he began to be haunted by a sense of isolation and friendlessness. It was now 30 hours since he had tasted food, and it seemed that game shunned his trail, for he saw none of the many small animals he had passed on the previous night. And the sight he had had that day of the great wedge-tailed eagle, of the carpet snake, of the grey rock wallaby, these only added to the uncanny strangeness of his surroundings. In one sense, persecution, witting and unwitting, had made a wild beast of him during his confinement in the circus. But by reason of the close confinement which had accompanied these persecutions, increasing self-dependence and self-reliance had not come with the access of fierceness and wildness. Finn inherited fighting instincts and savage ferocity under persecution from a long and noble line of hunting and fighting ancestors, but he inherited few instincts which bore practically upon the matter of picking up his own living, of walking alone, of depending exclusively upon himself, and of leading the solitary life of the really wild carnivora. But this would have troubled him very little if the scene of his present wanderings had been, say, some part of Sussex. As it was, the big snake, the huge eagle, the screaming cockatoo, the nerve-shaking cacophony of the jackass, and the half-flying progress of the big wallaby, all combined with the huge wildness of the country and its vegetation to oppress Finn with the sense of being a lone outcast, an outlier in a foreign land which was full of sinister possibilities. The recollection of that hissing 9-foot worm, of a thickness as great and greater than that of his own legs, lingered unpleasantly with Finn. Also, he was getting very hungry. While these impressions were sinking into the Wolfhound's mind, the country through which he was travelling was becoming more open, more like a long-neglected park, in which many of the trees were dead, and all had a gaunt and scraggly look, with their thin, pointed, grey-green leaves, their curiously tortured-looking limbs, and their long, rustling streamers of decaying bark. But however Finn might feel in the matter of loneliness, it was with a pang of something like horror that he came presently upon a barbed wire fence, exactly like the one he had leaped on the previous night, directly after leaving the circus. Could it be possible that the circus had been moved during the day to this place, and the barbed wire fence brought with it? Finn prowled cautiously up and down that fence for a couple of 100 yards in each direction, peering beyond it and sniffing and listening with the extreme of suspiciousness, before he finally leaped the wire and continued his way in a southeasterly direction. 5 minutes later he saw a rabbit, and though he lost it, by reason of the fact that it was sitting within a foot of its burrow and disappeared with lightning-like rapidity at sight of Finn, yet he was cheered by this homely sight, and pursued his way with renewed hope in the matter of supper. A moment later, and he stopped dead in his tracks, as though shot, and then crawled softly aside to take cover behind a thicket of scrub. In topping an abrupt little ridge he had come suddenly into view of a bark gunyah, or shanty, in the triangular opening of which, beside a bright fire, sat a man and a big black hound. A billy can swung over the fire on a tripod of stakes, and the man was engaged with his supper. Finn did not know, of course, that the man was a boundary rider, and his dog a not very well-bred kangaroo hound. The wind was northwest, or the kangaroo hound would surely have scented Finn's approach and given tongue. For a long time Finn lay under the cover of his thicket, peering through the darkness at the boundary rider and his dog. And while Finn gazed, his thoughts were very busy, both with matters of his own knowledge and experience, and with vague instinctive knowledge, dream and dream experiences, which came to him from his forebears of old, even as a setter's or a pointer's hunting knowledge comes to him in the vanguard of experience. The thing that most impressed Finn in the picture he saw was the figure of the black hound, stretched at ease beside the fire, steadily eyeing its master. Every once in a while the man would break a chunk from his damper, or cut a morsel from his meat and toss it to the kangaroo hound, who opened and closed its jaws like a steel trap, and gulped the gift with portentous solemnity, and absolutely without visible sign of any emotion whatever. The hound showed only watchfulness. Finn heard its jaw snap, and could almost hear the gulp which disposed of each morsel. The sight and sound gave an edge to the Wolfhound's already keen appetite, and almost unconsciously he drew nearer and yet nearer to the gunyah, crouching low to the ground as he moved, his hindquarters gathered under him, ready for springing, like a huge cat. There was no suggestion of circuses or cages or cruelty about the picture Finn saw, but his recent experiences had been far too severe to admit of anything like the old simple trustfulness in his attitude. That could never be again. Even hunger would never make this Wolfhound trustful again, but for all that there was something in the picture of the campfire and the pair who sat beside it which drew Finn strongly, tugging somehow at his heartstrings, pulling at him strongly, softly, drawing him as by silken cords of instinct and immemorial association. So far as his own life in the world went, this was the first camp fire Finn had ever seen. One could not say exactly how or why it should have been so, but it is a fact that, while crouching, Finn gazed upon and crept closer to that camp fire, his mind was full of affectionate thoughts and memories of the Master, and of the old days of their happy companionship. Up until this evening he had not thought of the Master for many days. Chapter 17